So let's, as we always do, begin by having some time of reflection on last week's material. Last week, of course, we looked at pastoral care and pastoral theology, and we thought a lot about what that is, what some of the skills are that are necessary in that area. For example, the importance of listening. So, has there been anything during the week that you've noticed or that stuck out for you last week that you're still pondering? So have a bit of conversation, as we always do, to start LiFT by thinking about last week's theme, and I'll be back with you shortly. Let's move on to our topic for this evening and preaching. And I guess it's important to start by saying that you might well be sitting there thinking, well, this really isn't for me because I never preach. And this material that we're looking at tonight is as much about communication generally. It's not just about whether you preach or whether you ever preach a formal sermon kind of thing in a pulpit on a Sunday. Although that's sort of underlying some of the material we'll look at this week. Certainly, hopefully from this you can take some reflections on communication generally. And that can also extend to things like writing in parish magazines, even preparing intercessions actually, because they're part of communicating the gospel, to any form of communication, not just in a church context of course, but in your daily lives as disciples. When I was thinking about this evening's session, a few stories and experiences came to mind. I'll try and sort of recount them in order roughly when they happened. But when I was training for ordination some years ago now, one of our tutors one time preached a sermon that rather annoyingly has become imprinted very firmly on my memory, but I'm not sure it's for a particularly good reason, and that he just sort of stood up at the sermon slot and said, quite simply, after a short preamble, the Eucharist is not a rehearsal. Amen. And sat down. Now, somewhat annoyingly, I can remember this. It's probably the only sermon that one of the few sermons that I actually remember, because it was only 6 words long. And can you imagine if your vicar got up into the pulpit or whatever and preached a sermon that was 6 words long? You might feel a little bit shortchanged, possibly, or you might think, oh, that's okay, that's interesting. I mean, his point was, I think, that the Eucharist isn't it's not a rehearsal or something. It's an actual, we do it week by week because we're engaging actively in the story of Jesus' death and resurrection. So we shouldn't take it for granted. I mean, he could have kind of said that, but he just chose to kind of give the headline. So that's the 6-word sermon, which I remember. When I was a curate, so quite newly ordained, I remember going to visit a family to do with a funeral, and in the English context particularly, the sort of the sermon is kind of, you kind of weave the eulogy into it. So in the English context, you don't have people standing up and giving lots of eulogies. Usually it's the person taking the funeral, the minister, who talks to the family about the person and then kind of weaves that into the sermon. And I remember speaking to this family who I think were just sort of in a state of shock really at the death of this lady, and I sort of said to them, well, can you tell me a little bit about, let's call her Mary, and all they could really tell me was that she liked potatoes. And I was like, okay, anything else? She really liked potatoes. She made really good potatoes, apparently, for Sunday dinners. They sort of talked a lot about these potatoes, and I was kind of, had my notebook, as curates do, very keen, and I just sort of wrote down potatoes and sort of circled that and that's really all I had to go on for the sermon was potatoes. And I thought, well, there aren't really many biblical references, if any, to potatoes. So what I ended up doing was just talking about hospitality, really, and the importance of that, because what I extrapolated from the potato with the people is that actually she was a very good host and made sure that people had the very best potatoes possible. So sometimes when you're sort of thinking about what you're going to communicate and how you're going to communicate, you know, you might not be working with fantastic material, but you just sometimes need that little hook that can open up a world, if you like, of broader understanding. So that was the potatoes. Yes, then I did don't worry, this is not all going to be anecdotes about my curacy, but these stories did come to mind, and they just, I guess, they tell a human side of preaching as well. But the landlord of the pub in the village where I was a curate dropped dead very suddenly, and I was asked, the parish was in an interregnum at the time, so I was asked to take Mike's funeral, and he was, you know, relatively young. I think he was in his early 50s, and I went over to the pub. I guess it was the night, you know, he died in the morning, I think, and everybody was gathering at the local pub, and I sort of walked in to try and get some try and get a sense of how people were really, and begin to think about what preaching in that context might be. And of course nobody told me that Mike had an identical twin brother, so I walked into the pub and there was this man sitting at a table with a pint, which my immediate reaction was like, oh, whoa. Okay, you're obviously not Mike, because as far as I know Mike is sadly no longer with us. But I sat down and talked to Mike's brother, who was, literally identical twins. They were identical twins. Very strange. But again, the theme from that was all about hospitality and the way in which Mike had, you know, welcomed people into the pub in the English context. Again, a great community gathering place. He was actually a Catholic, but they wanted the service in the local Anglican church. They wanted it to be a Eucharist. Didn't mind that I was female and an Anglican priest. That was absolutely fine. Church was packed. I consecrated loads of bread and wine. About 10 people received communion. So I had a group of trainee priests who were with me, and I sort of said to them, right, one of you is a designated driver and the rest of you are finishing that, okay? I think they have to spend the rest of the day lying down after that. But again, that's not really relevant to the theme of preaching. But the thing is, in the sermon, the reading became the wedding at Cana, which was actually quite helpful because there was a multiplication of wine during the service, but it really was able to speak into that context of hospitality. So again, you know, sometimes you've just got the tiniest thing or the one theme that actually is the thing that can carry you through. A few years ago, actually I've been to Fiji a few times. In this role, and usually when you go to Fiji, or quite often, I'm asked to preach, but there's very little information about kind of what's going on. So on one occasion Miles was with me, and Archbishop Winston said to me, you know, Helen-Ann, you will preach on Sunday. And then he turned to Miles, my husband, and said, and you will also preach. And if any of you know my husband, he's a musician, and his face, I think, went pale. And anyway, he got into the pulpit and decided that his theme was just going to be Bula. Hello, it's great to be here. So that was that. And then another time where Archbishop Winston asked me to preach, and I said, what's the reading? And he said, this is the reading. Well, by the time we got to the church, the reading had changed. So I'd been preparing in my mind what I might say, and sat down, and, you know, a reading from the Holy Gospel according to, well, it was a different reading. So I thought, okay. So, you know, you might think, as indeed some of this material says, you need a lot of time to prepare. Well, quite often you just won't have that time. So it's about, I guess, developing handy ways to, you know, to find your way into the context of preaching. Is there a sort of template that you can use? And often when I'm preparing to preach, I'll think about what the reading is, what its context is. So if it's, you know, reading from, I don't know, Mark chapter 6, you think, well, okay, what's happening in and around that chapter? What's an initial reflection on the reading? So I'll read it through. What's a reflection on that? How might I engage or encourage people to engage with it in their local context? So kind of make that bridge between text and where people are. And then, I guess finally, how do you send people out, sort of thing? How do you kind of wrap it up and send people out with a thought that they can carry with them into the week? So context, reflection, engagement, making that bridge with context, and then sending out. How do you send people out so that they can, you know, they might not remember all the detail of what you say, but they might just be able to think about something in it that connects with them during the week. That can be really important and helpful. So that's really good. This is not about preaching, but just while I'm on it, my other night, just so you know, I've had some interesting and slightly dodgy experiences as a curate. My other nightmare experience was I preached a sermon at another funeral, which I thought was pretty on the money, and this was to be followed by a CD rendition of Robbie Williams' song Angels, which some of you might know was all the rage at one point, and everybody was having it, requesting it for funerals. But better that than a family who wanted meatloaf bat out of hell. I thought, no, don't think we can allow that one. But anyway, Angels, and of course our church warden put himself in charge of starting the CD player, and you know, it's fine, I'll do that. And when it got to the bit, did we hear Angels? No, we heard another Robbie Williams song called Let Me Entertain You, which in the context of the middle of a funeral was... for a rookie curate like me, kind of, that was not a good thing. But anyway, there we go. If it's going to go wrong, it probably will, but it's all right. So anyway, I digress. Let's get back to the point of preaching. So, what is preaching? Well, in one level, I've said it's really about communication. So just think about it in a really broad sense. And Rosalind Brown, who's a canon at Durham Cathedral, actually, who's a fantastic preacher and has a really good sense of reflection, deep theological reflection on preaching. You know, she talks about making the link between reading and context. And she writes this reflection, which is quite interesting because it's sort of based on a particular story in 2 Samuel. She says this: when Nathan went to see King David following his hushed-up affair with Bathsheba and the resulting death of her husband in battle, which had been carefully set up to look like an accident, he had an awkward message for the king. In effect, he had to preach a sermon that involved judgment to a congregation of 1. How should he do it? And we know from the story in 2 Samuel that he went about it in an extraordinarily effective way. He told a once-upon-a-time story about a rich man who killed a poor man's only lamb to feed a visitor. The effect was instantaneous. David was furious and pronounced judgment on the rich man, thus enabling Nathan to turn the tables and in 4 words drive his message home: you are the man. So I had my 6-word sermon. This is a 4-word sermon. You are the man. David immediately repented and Nathan announced God's response. So in probably no more than 3 minutes, one of the most effective sermons ever preached was delivered. It had a purpose, it knew its audience, it had an appropriate methodology, unambiguous content and clear delivery, it engaged its hearer, evoked a response, and led to godly action. What more can we ask of preaching? In probably no more than 3 minutes, one of the most effective sermons ever preached was delivered. It had a purpose, it knew its audience, it had an appropriate methodology, unambiguous content and clear delivery, it engaged its hearer, evoked response, and led to godly action. So there's some interesting points there, isn't there? I guess firstly the one about length. So the kind of classic question, well, if you are preaching, how long does a sermon need to be? And I know that Dean Peter Rickman was recently in Kuching, and he was telling us about this in Synod, that he was asked at sort of no notice really to preach, and they said, probably about 25 minutes to half an hour should be fine. And his response was, okay. I'm not sure whether he did actually preach for 25 minutes, half an hour, but that's quite a long time actually. When you can potentially deliver something really helpful in 3 minutes. I often, not often, but sometimes like to listen to something called Thought for the Day, which is broadcast on Radio 4 during their breakfast programme, the BBC, and they have somebody in every morning just giving a reflection for the day, and that's usually about 3 minutes long, and it's quite a good discipline actually if you yourself can think about how you might communicate a message in 3 minutes, because you can actually say quite a lot in 3 minutes. 3 minutes doesn't sound like a long time, but you can actually put a lot into a 3-minute sermon. So it's worth trying that. Equally, I think when I preach, usually I go for between 7 and 10 minutes maybe, maybe 12 at a push, but certainly wouldn't want to do too much more than that, because I think you end up, the danger is you'll lose people. They just begin to switch off. So I think a sermon doesn't have to be half an hour, doesn't have to be an hour. Shorter is good. If you can deliver the message, then that's absolutely fine. And I think that goes for communication generally. If you're writing, particularly say for a church, a pew sheet or a bulletin, you're not going to write something that's pages and pages long, are you? Because people are not going to read that. Whereas something that's concise, maybe a paragraph, that can do the job just as effectively. Same goes even with preparing intercessions. We've talked about intercessions a little bit already. It doesn't have to be a long shopping list of things. It can be, they can be beautifully crafted in quite a concise manner to get the point across. So you can think, beyond this session of all sorts of ways in which you communicate generally, and how you can do that perhaps in a way that reflects this example that Rosalind Brown gives. So take a bit of time now in your local groups just to reflect on the things that you think make for a good sermon. It's all relative, of course, and each of us will bring our own stories and experiences to the picture, but if you had to identify some of the key things that for you stand out as important in a sermon and preaching, what would those things be? So have a conversation in your local groups, and I'll be back with you soon. Everybody, hope you've had a good discussion on what makes for a good sermon, and perhaps what are some of the things that perhaps aren't so helpful in preaching, and hopefully within your group there's a wide range of views as well, which is always quite helpful, because preaching is definitely not one size fits all. There'll be different times and in different places a different kind of message will be needed, and a way of delivering that will change depending on person, and we'll get a little bit into that in just a moment. So I guess at the heart of what preaching is that it's about communicating good news. in some form, good news about God, and bringing the story of what God has done through Jesus Christ and the power of the Holy Spirit to a world that needs to hear this message. So, and this is true again, I think, of any form of communication, that although you might just be communicating in a place, in a local, actually what you're communicating has broader implications than that, in a sense, because you are joining the great cloud of witnesses. So you're always connected beyond just the place where you are. And for Anglicans and for other denominations that follow the lectionary, for example, this is quite an important thing, particularly in the terms of a Sunday context of preaching, that you are seeking to articulate and reflect on a particular reading in your place, but you're doing that in the knowledge that Christians all over the world will also be interacting with exactly the same passage of Scripture, and that's quite an exciting thing. And so that, as I've said, and I'll keep saying, that does have implications again for things like crafting intercessions. Because sometimes I've heard intercessions that are crafted that also reflect a reading, so that the whole liturgy, if you like, and of course Stephen will be talking about liturgy next week, but the whole liturgy has a sense of connection. In a sense, the whole liturgy could be called itself a sermon, if you like, or a parable in action. So your message of communication needs to somehow bear in mind that you're communicating a message beyond just the confines of your particular context. And that's quite an important thing, because ultimately communicating the gospel is about talking about transformation and change wherever you are. It's also about providing comfort and hope in the broader context of the whole of the Christian journey. And as it says here, preaching a sermon doesn't happen in a vacuum either. You're always going to be affected by what's happening. What's happening in your life, actually, and how you're feeling, and what's happening in the life of your congregation, what's happening in the life of your town, your village, your city, etc., etc. So that's back to that point about the universality as well. If there's a major global event, for example, how are you going to respond to that in the context of a sermon? Recently, we remembered 20 years since the death of Princess Diana, and I remember in England, of course, that news broke on Sunday morning, and probably certainly in the English context, every vicar who prepared their sermon for the Sunday morning had to kind of get rid of that and speak into that context, which in terms of national life in England had a profound impact on people as they went to church. And in fact, for a number of people, certainly this is true in my parish church in Sunderland, this was the first that they'd heard of it when the vicar suddenly announced it at the start of the service, because it was early in the morning. So we always need to pay attention, I guess, to what's happening around about us. We're not in a vacuum when we're communicating. Rowan Williams, former Archbishop of Canterbury, describes preaching as the telling of good news that makes a difference. It's quite a good description. Telling of good news that makes a difference. And he also talks about, I just put this in because I thought this was quite interesting, bishops as being carriers of dangerous opportunities. So watch out when the bishop comes to preach, because the bishop might be a carrier of a dangerous opportunity, and who knows what might happen. Well, I thought that was quite funny. Rosalind Brown, again, she comments that to preach, I love this, is to be open to being pinched by God. How about that? Open to transformation as we experience the Holy Spirit's moving upon the face of the waters in our life, hearing afresh in our situation God's proclamation, let there be light. It's a wonderful few sentences of that. Evokes that creation story in Genesis, of course, but makes it relevant to our own lives how the Holy Spirit can move on the waters of our own being, and how then both the preaching can evoke the proclamation, let there be light, but then what difference is that going to make to us going forth from that place? How can we ensure that light shines? And there are various points, again, from Rosalind Brown, bottom of page 17, which you might want to spend some time looking at. What I'd like to move now to is spend a little bit of time thinking about the person who preaches, so ourselves, basically, and who we are, and even our personality, because that comes out in how we preach and how we communicate. You can't really preach somebody else's sermon, you see what I mean? I couldn't, on a Sunday morning, just simply read out a sermon that someone else had crafted, because it's not my voice, and the chances are it doesn't necessarily fit my style or personality. So I have to, how I preach and communicate has got to be true to who I am. I remember once, this is not in a preaching context, but at an academic conference when I was a student, I was helping out, and one of the speakers couldn't attend, so I was asked to read out their academic paper, and it was a really weird experience, because all these learned people were sat round listening to me delivering this very erudite paper, which I didn't entirely understand. And of course it wasn't my paper, but they wanted it read out all the same. And that's always sort of stayed in my mind as an example of, you have to be true to yourself and how you communicate. And the same goes true for writing in parish bulletins. Even intercessions. Now, there are some really good templates for intercessions out there and some material that you can draw on, but it often helps to nonetheless adapt that to your own voice and your own style, because it's ultimately you're conveying that, and that's all the person listening has to go on. So here's a quote from John Killinger in his book Fundamentals of Preaching. There are few vocations in which the character and inner life of the persons are as important as they are in the ministry. To preach well Sunday after Sunday, preachers must be in touch with the deepest resources of their beings. Their spirits must be whole and alert, sensitive to inner feelings and to the needs of others. They must be relaxed enough to draw upon their wit and knowledge, yet excited enough to leap beyond the given sum total of their powers and produce sermons that are obviously given to God. There is no profession in which performance depends so much upon the accumulation of insight and information. Gosh, that sounds very, very, quite lofty, actually, I think I would describe that. But it's kind of reminding us that, our inner life is important, because that will match how we deliver and communicate on the outside. Yes, so in our Episcopal vision, we started that with grounded in prayer. Prayer is really important. Nurturing that inner spiritual life is really a key to effective communication in any context. Even how you talk with your neighbour, or conversation you might have during the day. How are you connecting your inner life, which God nurtures, and how are you then communicating that as you go about your daily life? So making that connection between inner and outer is really important when thinking about communication and preaching in particular. So what you find on pages 18 to over to 20 are some different category types, I guess, of person, and the chances are that you're not going to wholly fit one of these, and you probably will have bits from each, but they're quite useful tools for reflecting on yourselves, on what sort of person you think you are, and therefore what are the strengths in your ability to communicate that you think connect most effectively. So what I'd like you to do now in your groups, if you can, and you can ask your local tutor to facilitate this if you want, is to just take a look at these different category types: sensing, intuitive, feeling, thinking, and just begin to reflect a little bit yourselves and in your group. Are there some bits that you resonate with, that you think, oh yes, I think I'm more of an intuitive person? Because having some self-awareness and self-knowledge in that regard can be quite helpful when you're preparing to communicate in preaching or another form of communication. So let's spend a little bit of time in our local groups doing some work on these types, and I'll be back with you soon. Thinking a little bit about three important elements: imagination, pastoral care, and prophecy. So the need to use your imagination in how you communicate, the need to be pastorally sensitive both in the method and the content of any communication, and I think sometimes something that perhaps we Anglicans are less keen on, the challenge to be prophetic, and what does that mean in the context of a sermon preaching. So before I say a little bit about those three areas, let's just take a couple of minutes to buzz in your groups about which, if any of these things, really you think, yes, that's really important. Okay, let's just take a couple of minutes to engage with those three things, and I will be back with you in literally 2 minutes. Let's just take these three sections in turn and do some reflections on that. So there's a few quotes here about imagination, generally, which you can reflect on, but here's a couple of techniques that can help, I guess, galvanise the imagination into action a little bit. They're techniques that I sometimes like to use to help me think about what the key message might be in a reading when I'm preparing a sermon. And the first one is to use the Japanese poetic form known as haiku, which is 3 lines. Some of you may have done this before. 3 lines of 5, 7, 5 syllables, and you've really got to focus the mind on an effective communication in that, particularly if you want to reflect a whole biblical passage. And just by way of kind of segue into that, I love the poet Emily Dickinson generally, but I love this poem of hers where she talks about tell all the truth, but tell it slant, and that sense that when Jesus told stories or parables in the context of the Gospels, he's conveying a truth, but he's kind of doing it at an angle, sort of thing. You see what I mean? Because it means that the disciples and we have to engage our brains into making the connection, so that we can see not just the face value of it, but the kind of the deeper truth that lies within. So I looked at the gospel reading for this coming Sunday, which is Matthew 22, and my haiku on that is Pharisees in trap, is it lawful to pay tax? Jesus points to God. So if you've read the gospel reading for this Sunday, you might be able to guess what that is about. It's about who should you pay tax to God or to Caesar. But I find doing that on a gospel passage particularly just kind of gets my brain working a little bit, I suppose, and it kind of I suppose fires my imagination in a way. Another technique is to use this one where you have a 5-line poem based on a syllable count. So you've got, you can see there that there are 5 lines. So the first one is a word, a noun, which is either the title or the name of the subject. 3 words, adjectives which describe the subject. 2 words. You need to know your English grammar with this very well, which describe the verb in line 4. It certainly engages the brain, that's for sure. 1 word, a verb, which describes the subject in line 1, and 1 word, another noun. So Rosalind Brown, who's got a bit more of an engaged brain than I do in this sense, gives an example on Jesus' passion. Jesus, bleeding, mocked, humiliated, unresistingly, agonisingly, feels the nails. So I decided to have a go at this, look at, not with the Gospel for this Sunday, but there's a reading from Exodus set for this Sunday, and this is what I got out of that. Moses, bold, questioning, demanding, expecting, anticipating, sees the back. You're probably thinking, right. So obviously you need to go to that biblical passage, and if you do, hopefully you will get that. Now, it might not be for everybody playing with words. I quite enjoy doing that, but I think the point is a bit like doing some kind of physical exercise. You're actually getting the brain working with a passage to try and think, well, how do I communicate something from this reading in a way that's concise? And that's why particularly the haiku is very helpful in that regard, because you've only got 5 syllables, 7 syllables, 5 syllables, so you've got to focus the mind on that. So you might want to have a go yourself with the readings from this coming Sunday. See if you can compose your own haiku or 5-line poem. Give that a go. Why not? So that's imagination and pastoral care. So again, Rosalind Brown reflects on this. She says, faithful preaching comes from a pastoral heart and embodies a prophetic message. We offer pastoral care in our preaching and will reach many people at one time within the context of worship. Pastoral preaching rests on knowing our hearers, who soon realise whether or not we understand and care for them as individuals and as a congregation. So, you might, we won't do this now, but you might want to recall during the week a time when a sermon has connected with a particular pastorally sensitive situation in your community, or a particularly pastorally sensitive time in your own life, and how has that been important. Of course, it's not just in the content of how a sermon is delivered, it will probably also be in the style and the manner of delivery. Yes, so if you've got somebody in a pulpit who's shouting, that's not entirely helpful. I think I said to you a few weeks ago when I was in Te Aroha, the fire siren was going off next door to the pulpit, so I had to raise my voice, which I'm not accustomed to doing in the context of preaching. It didn't feel very comfortable to be shouting at people, but I had no choice. But that's a serious point. Nobody wants to feel harassed or harangued or got at. That's just not very pastorally sensitive. So you need to think about the mode of delivery as well as the content. And that goes for any kind of communication, actually. Similarly, in one of these bullet points, I think it's quite helpful. We must be careful not simply to give the people what they want to hear. Yep. So sometimes the most pastoral thing is to be prophetic. So it's finding that balance between not just giving people the thing that will provide comfort, but also that will just provide that little bit of challenge, because that's where growth can happen. That's an important thing as well. So the balance really between being prophetic, having pastoral care, and using your imagination is really important. So you might want to reflect on that this week. Is there anything particularly that you think is more important? Is imagination key? Is pastoral care key? Is prophecy key? How does that speak into your context? I said a little bit at the start about preparation and getting ready to preach. That model of context, reflection, engagement, and sending out. That's one way. Rosalind Brown, I think, somewhat optimistically talks about doing some preparatory work 3 weeks in advance. When I read that, I was like, oh gosh, there's no way that I prepare for a sermon 3 weeks in advance. But I think one thing I do if I have to preach is at least, and this will be a week before, I suppose, read the readings and just let them sit in my mind. And it might be that I don't actually write the sermon, because I tend to write my sermons mostly rather than bullet point them. That might happen quite late in the day, but the point is I've had several days doing other stuff, but I've been sitting with the readings. So you make connections with things that you see or conversations that you have. So in that sense, you're always engaged with the world around you. And that can be true as well if you're preparing to write intercessions, if you're writing a pew sheet, bulletin. Make sure that it's connecting with where people are. So Rosalind Brown has quite a prescriptive way of 3 weeks, 10 days, counting down, a week before. It's if you've got time to do that, that's great. But she also raises some important points about what season are you in? And that's why we observe our seasons, don't we? We're ordinary time. Are we in Advent? Are we in Lent? Because the tone of your message might be different in Lent, in Holy Week even, or post Easter. So bearing in mind your environment, I'd say is really key. So if you do preach or you do communicate in some form, you can think quite carefully about what's your environment and how you're interacting with it as you go about your daily lives. Okay, so that's probably where we'll leave it for this evening. Again, you might want to pay attention to the sermon this coming Sunday in the light of the material that we've thought about this evening. Is there anything in the sermon that you think connects with imagination, with prophecy, with pastoral care, for example? Any illustrations or particular styles that are used? So I can see Waihee getting quite excited there. So somebody from Waihee must be maybe getting some top tips for preaching this Sunday. Anyway, that's or something. It's good to see. It's good to see. So anyway, thank you. Have a great week, everybody. And next week, Stephen Black's going to be sitting in the hot seat where I usually sit, because he's going to be taking you through his session on worship and liturgy, which was going to be really good. So do your journal writing, do your reflecting, and come together again next week. We've only got 3 or 4 weeks left on LiFT now, 4 weeks I think. So we're reaching the end, which is incredible. So thanks again everybody for your attention tonight, and look forward to seeing you soon. So we shall do our usual farewells. I'm going to start with Waihee, saying good night to Waihee. Have a great week, everybody. Good evening and good night to Tokoroa. Great to see you there. Good evening and good night to New Plymouth. And good evening and good night to Morrinsville. Great to see you there. Good evening, good night to Taumarunui. And good evening and good night to Dinsdale. Great to see you. We know you're there. That's the most important thing. And as we always do, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time of day you're doing LiFT offline. Great to have you with us again, and look forward to seeing you soon. Enjoy night prayer together, everyone, and God bless and have a good week. Take care.